it's Leigh from Vagabond Studios, and today I'm going to show you how to make quick and easy scatter terrain for your tabletop war games. Let's get into the supplies you're going to need. Suitable basing material. I like to go with a piece of MDF. This is about 1/4 inch thick, and I've cut it to 3.5 by 3.5 inch square. Textured rolling pin. Get this from Green Stuff World. This is the cobblestone base, and it's pretty simple. You place down your green stuff, or your resin, or your clay. You can even use like paper clay, and you just roll it out. Epoxy resin. You can use green stuff. I use Epoxy Sculpt. This stuff about 24 bucks on Amazon, eBay, you name it. And well, part A and part B will last you, even if you use it quite a bit, a very, very long time. And finally, a whole mess of resin terrain bits. This stuff's from TT Combat, and what we have is the Asian terrain kit. There's a bunch of cool stuff in it. This is 2 kits worth, so you've got some Buddhas, foo dogs, and some braziers, arches, gongs, you name it. It's all there. First thing I'm going to want to do is kind of sort through my stuff and figure out exactly what kind of layout I'm going to do. These foo dogs I'm going to set aside because I have another project in store for them. So, we're doing a Eugene-themed table for a Showdown event, Infinity Showdown event coming up at Shiv Games in Salt Lake City on May 10th. And I want to have a lot of Asian-themed terrain, particularly with a kind of a Buddhist leaning to it. We have a tabletop that's going to have part of a walled-off temple in the middle of a slum city. So we're going to hold on to this Buddha. Now that we figured out what we're going to do, let's put all this stuff aside. And go ahead and remove all the terrain pieces here, because I know where we're going. Just want to coat the base here with epoxy resin. And like I said, green stuff will work, but the part about green stuff that kind of a dirty little secret is that it's just kind of a 2-part waterproof plumber's putty. It's an epoxy, and if you can find the off-brand stuff that's not commercially made by like Games Workshop, you're going to save yourself a bit of money. Otherwise, I'd say Epoxy Sculpt's the best way to go. It actually has more of a working time to it than green stuff does. So yeah, I like to go with the black, even though it does, you know, it does dye your hands black, but it washes off super easy. And the reason why I go with the black is just because I know it's mixed. It's pretty obvious when it's mixed. Basically, you want to keep rolling it, twisting it, and rolling it until you have an even color blend. So you don't want to have any swirls of white or black. You just want a straight kind of dark gray, dull black coat. All right, now that that's all mixed, get in there like your Play-Doh Fun Factory when you're a kid and spread it out all over your piece of basing. With basing, like I said, I go with a plywood or an MDF. You go with a plastic card. I've seen people use fiberboard or chipboard, and that works okay, but you have to be really careful that it doesn't warp. Now, if you get this stuff on there and you can get it to cure without warping, then you're fine, even on fiberboard or even cardstock. I've done it on cardstock before, and you do get nice stiff terrain from that. So if you need something that's like a flat terrain piece, not something elevated with that 1/4-inch lip, then you could do that. You just want to make sure that you use a good coating of resin on there first. And the resin isn't wet. It doesn't have any water to it. It's more, I'm almost positive that it's a petroleum base. So I don't think it's going to warp a paper-based terrain piece. And that's what we'll be doing. Like if you need to do scatter terrain of trees, you just want to do a small clump of trees, and you can spread this stuff. Just spread it flat on your cardstock and stick your tree straight in it and sculpt some rocks. Or, as you'll see in a minute, this stuff is really sticky right now, and anything that you place in it, it's going to adhere to it like glue, which is great because we're going to be sticking a bunch of terrain pieces in there. And you want to get it wet, and the reason why you want to get it wet is because you don't want this epoxy to stick to your rolling pin. I mean, these things aren't cheap. They're about $14. But they do the job. They do the job nicely. All right, so just place it where you want it. You can see a little piece that came up, a little piece of brick that came up with the rolling pin, and that's fine. We like a little variation. So with this, I immediately stick it in water because I don't want the stuff that's down in the recesses to actually stick. It can be a little difficult to clean up. All right, I'm going to go around the edges. Clean this stuff up. The nice part is, while we're waiting for the resin to dry, which takes about 2 hours. Normally, if you're going to do some sculpting with this, you want to mix the resin and let it sit for about an hour before you start sculpting it. But since we're going to be using it, its adhesive qualities, we're going to go ahead and stick stuff in it right now. So, first our block. Well, let's get the gong in there first. Make sure it's fairly well centered. Stick it down. Corner pieces. Stick those right in there. The nice part is this epoxy resin, I mean, it's glue at this point, so anything that I stick down to it is not coming off. It could take a pretty good bump even on a gaming table and be just fine. Let's get our sculptural element there. Put that right in front of it. Stick it in there. And then the foam block, this is probably not going to stick because it's completely non-porous. We're going to go ahead and put it in there to let it cure. So again, just to make sure I haven't missed anything before we get to the curing point. Put the gong part on, or the base for the gong, the pillars, and the caps for these little statue elements. Alright, so that looks good. We're going to give this about 2 hours to set up, and we'll come back and put some base coats and paint elements on. Alright, so I gave my resin some time to cure. It's been about 12 hours, but technically anywhere from 4 to 24 hours will do the trick. So, I mean, stuff's pretty durable. Really good, hard detail. It's basically a hard plastic at this point. So, great detail, and this would be very, very durable for scatter terrain. on just about any gaming table. So the next step is to get the rest of the pieces glued down. And then also of note, if you're using any kind of spray primer or spray paint, you're going to want to coat this if you're doing anything with expanded foam or insulation foam or even just a household styrofoam. Regular spray paint is going to eat that up. It's just going to go right through it. So you can take some Mod Podge. You can get this at just about any craft store, really, really inexpensive, or just plain old Elmer's glue. And you can mix it with paint. I like Mod Podge over glue because it has a little bit of a kind of a varnish worked into it. So it's going to make your resin a little bit stronger. But if you're using an airbrush, you can just go ahead and use any kind of regular spray-on primer that would be for an airbrush, because that's more of a water dilutable product and it's not going to eat up your styrofoam. So I'm going to go ahead and glue the separate pieces on, get everything finished up, and then we'll go straight to priming. So for the gong stand, I want to make sure that I keep the gong post up front. That's kind of a mistake I would normally make quite easily, and then have a good laugh at my own expense later. For the pedestal tops, I'm gonna make sure that I have the plastic cleaned up. Now, one thing when you're working with resin, and I didn't mention that earlier, you're going to want to give your resin pieces a quick bath with some dish detergent and some warm water to get the mold release that's just kind of naturally inherent with any kind of resin product off before you start gluing and painting. Because that stuff it's greasy, it's going to leave a little bit of a film on your pieces, and then you're going to find yourself, it's going to start with your paint job. So you're going to work on your paint job, you're going to get everything looking the way you want it, and then you're going to notice that your pieces are losing detail, getting duller, and then your base coat's going to show through, and after a while it's not even going to be that subtle. You're just going to have bare plastic again, and you don't want that, especially considering all the work that you're probably going to be putting into your terrain pieces, or even just your regular miniatures. And that's going to be the case with anything. I mean, unless it's already been base coated, like these WizKids goblins, you know, those have already been coated. Those already have a spray coat on them. So chances are you don't have to worry about cleaning them up too much. But any kind of commercial miniature or terrain piece that you pick up, unless it says specifically that it's been primed, it's probably still got a fairly liberal amount of spray cut or of mold release on it. Let's get the gong into the pedestal base here. Of course, that's going to be the trickiest piece for me, right? And hold your pieces in place for a minute while everything sets. Okay, and the last part is going to use a little Elmer's glue to get the Buddha down on the pedestal. And the reason why I'm using Elmer's over super glue is just that the super glue itself is also going to act with the solvents that are in there. That's going to eat up the foam just as well as the spray paint would. Alright, so we're going to give that about 10-20 minutes to go ahead and cure so that I don't have any pieces falling off from the base coat, and as soon as that's set, we'll get the base coating done. Alright, everything's been glued down, it's all secure, good to go, which is great. Before I go any farther, just want to make sure that you know that if you're going to use a spray can primer, that you're going to want to make sure you seal this. I know I've said it before, I'll say it again. I'm going to use an airbrush to prime. I was a little late to the party when it comes to an airbrush, but this Sotar 2020 from Badger is a beautiful, beautiful machine, and it does a very nice job. I've got my compressor set up to 40 psi. If you were to do miniatures at that pressure, you'd probably find it to be a bit overkill. But when it comes to spraying a primer, it's not really going to be a big deal. So I'm going to do a little bit more black than white for this first coat. I'm going to go for kind of a dark charcoal gray. And if you're using surface primer from Vallejo, you're going to find that it's already really nice and thin, so you don't have to use any kind of a airbrush medium to thin it out. Now if you do get spatter, it means that your primer has set up a little bit more than it was intended to be, in which case you'll want to use a little bit of the thinner. And now that my base coat has dried, I'm going to go ahead and start layering in some color. The reason why I really wanted to make sure that my base coat was dry before I started doing anything is if there was any pocket of primer that hadn't cured yet when I start laying in washes, it's just going to make everything muddy. And the last thing we want is muddy terrain. So first thing I'm going to do is brush on some gray. And I just use this shading gray. It's an airbrush shading gray. And the reason why I'm using it is because it's basically a wash just right out of the bottle. I'm doing a burnt umber, just a wet loose coat. I'm not too worried about detail on this yet. We're going to take care of that with washes. Let's go ahead and get the metallics in there. If you want to get real fancy, you could go with a non-metallic metallic. So you can just put your brown in there and do various washes and glazes until you get a good non-metallic metallic illusion effect in there. But nothing wrong with metallic paints. do a little bit of dry brushing now. And with dry brushing, it's not an exact science. Everybody's got their own technique. I'm more interested in the overall effect than I am in the mechanics of it. I always keep packs of blisters available to use as a canvas for dry brushing. Pretty sure this is dry. Yeah, I use my thumb as a canvas for everything while I'm painting. So, and all I'm doing, I'm not actually touching the model with more than just the tip of the brush. Dry brush can be overdone really, really easily. And so in this case, I'm just getting enough paint on there to give me a little bit of a raised effect. I'm not worried about doing stark contrasted highlights with my dry brush pass. It's I like to do dry brush that doesn't look like dry brush when it's done. I want a little bit of the detail to pop out without getting obnoxious about it. do a little bit of shading on the rock garden area. With that, I'm just going to do a combination of Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade. These washes from these shades from Citadel, really, really good. You'll hear people talk about them all the time. I heard about them for about a year before I even gave them a try, and I'd had so many bad experiences over the last 15 years with some of the Citadel paints not living up to my expectations, and it really seems like they've kind of figured their game out a little bit, quite a bit better. So with the Earthshade, Agrax Earthshade and the Nuln Oil, I'm just going to go through and shade the rocks. These are really, really thin shades, so you don't have to worry about thinning them down anymore, unless it's on an area like you can see the top of this rock here. It has more shading on it than I want it to, so I'm just going to take a wet brush and pull that off a little bit to help dull the shading. Rings. There was a monk out here working on this rock garden. Really nice sculpture going. Centric rings from a Zen master. On the inside of the ring here, where the larger rocks are, I'm just going to use a little more of the Agrax Earthshade. Get a little more color in there. The thing with Nuln Oil is that it's a pretty stark, sterile look, unless you add a little color. Okay, so we got our rock area in. And the last thing I'm going to do is go ahead and get some washes in on the actual pedestal for the gong. And the nice thing about this is that it's going to kind of bring out some of the strokes from the dry brushing. And it's a wet wash, but I want it wet like that. And the other nice part about any of these washes that you're using is that they're gonna, if you have a really strong contrast, if you went a little overboard on your dry brushing, the wash is gonna help tone it down a little bit. But since we're looking for a wood effect on this base, it's okay to just brush that stuff on, let it do its job, let it work. And you get areas like down here that are pooling. You have a couple of choices there. You can either wick it off with your brush, or you can work it into the base. Now in this case, I'm going to work it into the base because we're looking for a somewhat weathered, not dirty, but you know, semi-lived-in looking garden area. One of the things I like to do when I'm working on this kind of project, again, I'm going for fast. I'm going for a quick piece of scenery here. This scatter terrain will go down on the table on the temple side of the board, and it can be moved around from game to game. So I want it to be something that's modular and movable. But at the same time, I don't want to stress out if it gets dropped and breaks, because I want to be able to fix it, patch the paint up quickly. And I also have, less than a month to finish this board up. I've got most of the buildings finished, but I still have more scatter terrain to build. So I want to have good looking scatter terrain that doesn't take forever to make. So there we go. So there's the paint elements. Everything's been painted up. Everything looks pretty sharp. I mean, looking at it from my camera's about 2 feet away from the terrain. It is zoomed in a little bit, but you can see there's lots of stark, good strong contrast. It's a dramatic looking piece, and looks pretty good with a figure on it. So what I'm going to do now is let everything dry, probably a good half hour, and apply some flock to it, and that'll be the end of that model. Now that everything's set up and cured, all the paint's dry, I'm going to do the last step. I'm going to put some flock, a little bit of some organic greenery onto the terrain piece. So the two things I'm going to use, I've got some clump foliage here. This is some leftover stuff from another project. You can get this at any train store or hobby shop. It's just, I think it's just ground up sponge, to be honest, that's had some dye applied to it. It might be something else, I have no idea, but I've seen it done with sponge, and it's a pretty easy thing to make yourself if you have the time, effort, energy, and disposable blender. Also going to use some of this steppe grass. It's static grass from Army Painter, and pretty decent stuff. The reason why I like it is because it's not just one color. It's lighter green, dark green, a little bit of brown mixed in there. So what I want to do is break up the contours of this piece of terrain a little bit. So don't want to get too crazy or fancy with it. I'm going to put some of the clump foliage at the base of the Buddha's pedestal here. I'm probably going to go back through here. You can see some of the brickwork didn't quite come out in the wash with the wash step as much as I would have liked it to. So I'm going to go back through and kind of pick that out with a finer detail brush. And there's an area back here where I saw some of the paint didn't quite stick to the terrain as well as I would have liked it to, and that's fine because that's what this step's for. It's a terrain and scenery camouflage step. So just take this clump and stick it right in there. You don't want to let this dry. Of course, your Elmer's glue or your PVA glue, depending on where you're from. It's going to soak your clump foliage here is going to soak up that glue pretty aggressively. So if you don't give it time to set up, you're going to find that your clump foliage just comes right off of your terrain piece really quite easily. You can also use super glue to adhere it. I personally don't like to do that because you'll notice I use my finger to stick the foliage onto the terrain piece pretty aggressively. And I've had a couple of times where using super glue to stick the foliage on ended up sticking the foliage to my fingertip, which is, it's a lot of fun to have this abrasive, coarse, ground up sponge stuck to your fingertip. So a couple more smaller pieces on this side. Actually, we'll just call that good right there. And now for the static grass, I've already kind of indicated where I'm going to put it by where I have my green paint. So a little bit around the rock garden here, a little bit back here. And you could do a lot with this. You could get aggressive with it, like I mentioned earlier, and place quite a bit of static grass onto your model, or you could just do a little bit. I'm looking for an effect that makes the model look like I said earlier, like it's not completely neglected, but that it's seen better days. I really don't like the look of really pristine, clean terrain pieces on a War Games model. It just seems a little incongruous to have these clean, straight lines on buildings and terrain, and you've got troop models running all over the place, shooting each other up. I guess if it was the first stage of the engagement, that would make sense. So there you have it. It's finished. It just needs to dry up. I'm going to hit it with a couple of coats of spray varnish. My formula for that is that I'll go with a gloss varnish first, usually 2 coats, 3 coats for a piece of terrain that's going to go inside of shop, and then I'll hit it with a couple coats of matte varnish afterwards. Now this same technique can be used to do all kinds of terrain. So you've got this Buddha here with the gong and the 4 pedestals. Did the same technique with a 2 inch by 4 inch piece of MDF. This is laser cut terrain and a store-bought model tree for like a train layout, but looks really cool with the cherry blossoms. So with an Asian themed board, again, it's going to look really cool when you get it all set up. And then another Buddha garden here, different type of pedestal, but you can see the same technique was at play there. We've got the static grass set up and the aging. It really doesn't take a long time to do some really striking, really nice looking pieces of terrain. They're going to bring a lot of character and a lot of fun to your tabletop. I think that if you do these kind of projects and you take a little bit of time, don't drive yourself crazy in the process, but take a little bit of time and make some cool scatter terrain. You can move around the table. Your friends, your players, the people that you play your games with, they're going to appreciate it. They're going to have so much fun. A themed table brings so much character to your games of Infinity. You've got cover worked in here, so you can get your hockey slam guy. He's hiding behind that rice paper screen. This is gonna be a lot of fun to play on, and I can't wait to show it off. If you want to see this table in action, I mean, this is just a small part of it. This is just the scatter terrain. There's something like 25 buildings that are going into it, including a walled city temple, really cool ships. It's all going to be there. It's going to be at Shiv Games here in Salt Lake City, Utah, starting on May 13th. You'll be able to go play a game on this table. It's going to be really cool, really dramatic. We're setting it up for Salt Lake City Showdown. It's going to be a great event that's taking place on May 10th. And seriously, if you have any ideas of things that you would like to see me do on future episodes, just leave a comment below. I'll be happy to handle just about any subject, whether it's terrain, assembly of MDF terrain, painting, miniature painting, hobby painting. I can cover it all, and I'd be happy to do it. I'll also be leaving a list of supplies and components. That'll be in the information area right below this screen. Make sure to check out Vagabond Studios on Facebook, and if you like what you saw, please like, comment, subscribe. We'll talk with you soon.